In 1950, the world witnessed the first major war of the Cold War era. It was not fought in Europe. It was not fought between the United States and the Soviet Union directly. Yet it involved both powers, along with China, and it brought the world dangerously close to nuclear escalation. The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War. It sits in the shadow of World War II and is overshadowed by the Vietnam War that followed. But in many ways, it was a conflict that defined the Cold War's military reality. It was the first time the ideological divide between communism and capitalism turned into open, large-scale combat. To understand how the Korean Peninsula became the battlefield of superpower rivalry, we must go back to the end of World War II. For decades, Korea had been under Japanese occupation. Beginning in 1910, Imperial Japan annexed the peninsula and ruled it with strict control. Korean political movements were suppressed, culture was regulated, and the peninsula was integrated into Japan's imperial system. When Japan surrendered in August 1945 after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Korea was suddenly liberated, but without a clear plan for its future. The surrender created an urgent strategic question: who would disarm Japanese forces in Korea? Soviet troops were already advancing south from Manchuria. American forces were positioned in the Pacific. In Washington, American officials quickly drew a temporary dividing line across the peninsula at the 38th parallel. It was intended as a practical administrative boundary, nothing more. Soviet forces would accept Japanese surrender north of the line. American forces would do the same in the south. The line was drawn hastily, almost arbitrarily, on a map. It would become one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. In the north, Soviet forces helped establish a communist government under Kim Il-sung, a former guerrilla fighter who had operated against Japanese forces. Backed by Moscow, Kim built a regime modeled on Soviet political structures. Land reforms were implemented, industries were nationalized, and political opposition was eliminated. In the South, the United States supported the creation of a separate government under Syngman Rhee. Rhee was fiercely anti-communist and determined to prevent the spread of Northern influence. Political unrest and ideological conflict characterized the early years of South Korea's existence. The division of the peninsula hardened into two rival states, each claiming legitimacy over all of Korea. By 1948, two separate governments formally existed: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north and the Republic of Korea in the south. Neither accepted the legitimacy of the other. Border clashes became increasingly common. Skirmishes along the 38th parallel escalated throughout 1949. Both regimes spoke openly about reunification, by force if necessary. At the same time, the broader Cold War was intensifying. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, ending the American nuclear monopoly. Communist forces had taken control of China under Mao Zedong. The balance of power in Asia was shifting rapidly. In Washington, policymakers began to view global events through the lens of containment, the strategy of preventing further communist expansion. Korea, however, was initially seen as peripheral. In January 1950, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson outlined America's defensive perimeter in the Pacific, and Korea was not explicitly included. This omission may have been interpreted in Pyongyang and Moscow as a sign of limited American commitment. Kim Il-sung saw an opportunity. He believed that a swift military campaign could reunify Korea before the United States intervened decisively. He sought approval and support from Joseph Stalin. After careful calculation, Stalin agreed. He provided military equipment, training, and strategic backing. Kim also secured cautious support from Mao Zedong, who was consolidating communist control in China. The stage was set. In the early hours of June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in a coordinated, full-scale invasion. Tanks rolled south. Artillery fired. Infantry advanced rapidly. The assault was overwhelming. South Korean defenses, poorly equipped and unprepared for such a massive attack, collapsed quickly. Within days, Seoul fell. The invasion shocked the world. In Washington, President Harry Truman interpreted the attack not as a local civil war, but as a test of global resolve. To Truman and his advisors, Korea resembled a rehearsal for broader communist expansion. If aggression succeeded in Korea, it could spread elsewhere. The United States moved quickly. Taking advantage of the Soviet Union's temporary boycott of the United Nations Security Council, the UN passed a resolution condemning the invasion and authorizing collective military action. A multinational force, led primarily by the United States, was assembled to defend South Korea. The Korean War had begun. At first, the situation was dire for UN forces. North Korean troops advanced rapidly, pushing South Korean and American units southward. By August 1950, defending forces were confined to a small perimeter around the port city of Pusan. The line held, but barely. The war, which many expected to be brief, was already revealing itself as brutal and unpredictable. For civilians, the consequences were catastrophic. Cities changed hands multiple times. Refugee columns stretched for miles. Infrastructure collapsed. Families were separated. The peninsula became a landscape of displacement and destruction. The Korean War was no longer a regional conflict. It had become the first major armed confrontation of the Cold War, and it was only beginning. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, the speed of their advance surprised nearly everyone. The invasion had been carefully planned. Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks led the assault, supported by artillery and well-trained infantry units. South Korean forces, lightly armed and lacking heavy equipment, were unable to mount an effective defense. Seoul fell within 3 days. The collapse of the South Korean capital created a sense of urgency in Washington. President Harry Truman faced a defining moment. The United States had recently demobilized much of its military after World War II. American public opinion was weary of overseas conflicts. Yet Truman believed that failure to respond would send a dangerous message. If North Korea succeeded without resistance, the credibility of containment would be shattered. Truman did not ask Congress for a formal declaration of war. Instead, he framed the conflict as a police action under United Nations authority. This distinction was politically important, but on the ground it changed little. American forces were ordered in to combat. The first U.S. troops to arrive in Korea were underprepared. Units stationed in Japan were quickly deployed, often without adequate equipment or heavy weapons. Early engagements revealed serious weaknesses. American forces struggled against North Korean armor and coordinated assaults. The assumption that the war would be short began to fade. As July turned into August, North Korean forces pushed steadily southward. Major cities fell in succession. South Korean units retreated, regrouped, and retreated again. American reinforcements arrived, but the pressure remained intense. The North Korean objective was clear: drive UN forces into the sea before they could fully mobilize. By early August, defending forces were compressed into a shrinking area around the southeastern port city of Pusan. This defensive line became known as the Pusan Perimeter. It was the last significant foothold remaining under UN control. The perimeter stretched roughly 140 miles. It was not a fortified wall, but a defensive arc held together by determination and limited resources. American and South Korean troops dug in along river lines and hills. Supply ships arrived at Pusan Harbor, unloading ammunition, food, and reinforcements. Air superiority, provided by U.S. aircraft, became a crucial advantage. The fighting was relentless. North Korean forces launched repeated offensives, attempting to break through weak points along the line. Battles were fought in sweltering heat, in rugged terrain, and often at close range. Casualties mounted on both sides. For many American soldiers, Korea was their first experience of combat. For South Korean troops, the stakes were existential, the survival of their state. The Pusan Perimeter held. This defense was not merely tactical, it was strategic. Holding Pusan allowed the United Nations to build strength rather than collapse. Reinforcement continued to arrive. Equipment flowed steadily through the port. The war, which had seemed on the verge of ending in North Korean victory, began to stabilize. Meanwhile, in Washington and Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur considered a bold alternative strategy. Rather than continue a grinding defensive struggle, he proposed a risky amphibious landing far behind North Korean lines, at the port city of Inchon. Inchon was not an obvious choice. The harbor had extreme tidal variations, narrow channels, and strong currents. Military planners considered it hazardous. Yet MacArthur believed that surprise could compensate for risk. A successful landing at Inchon would cut North Korean supply lines, threaten their rear, and force a rapid retreat. The decision was made, but before that counteroffensive could unfold, the Pusan Perimeter had to survive. Throughout August and early September 1950, the line endured heavy assaults. North Korean troops came close to breaking through in several sectors, yet the defensive network held firm. American artillery and airstrikes played decisive roles in repelling attacks. Gradually, North Korean momentum slowed. Their supply lines stretched thin. Casualties accumulated. The rapid offensive that had begun in June was losing strength. The Korean War had entered a new phase. What had begun as a near-total collapse for South Korea was transforming into a test of endurance. The survival of the Pusan Perimeter ensured that the conflict would not end quickly. Instead, it would escalate. The initial invasion had nearly succeeded. The counterstroke was now forming, and the next move would reshape the war entirely. By early September 1950, the Korean War stood at a turning point. The Pusan Perimeter had held. United Nations forces had stabilized the southern front. Yet simply holding the line was not enough. If the war continued as a defensive struggle, the conflict could become a prolonged and costly stalemate. General Douglas MacArthur believed that bold action, not cautious defense, was required. His proposal was audacious. Rather than break out from Pusan in a gradual push north, MacArthur suggested striking deep behind North Korean lines with a large amphibious landing at the port of Inchon, near Seoul. The operation would sever supply routes, isolate North Korean forces in the south, and potentially collapse their entire offensive. The risks were considerable. Inchon was known for extreme tidal shifts. Mudflats stretched wide when the tide was low. Navigational channels were narrow and heavily defended. A failed landing could result in catastrophic losses. Many senior military officials in Washington were skeptical. They viewed the plan as unnecessarily dangerous. MacArthur remained confident. He argued that surprise was the key. North Korean commanders did not expect an amphibious assault at Inchon. Their focus remained fixed on the Pusan front. If the landing succeeded, It would transform the strategic landscape overnight. President Truman approved the operation. On September 15, 1950, under cover of naval bombardment and airstrikes, UN forces launched the amphibious assault. Marines and soldiers moved toward the sea walls of Inchon. Initial resistance was present but limited. The element of surprise had worked. Within hours, beachheads were secured. The landing marked one of the most dramatic reversals of the war. As UN forces advanced inland from Inchon, North Korean supply lines were cut. Simultaneously, troops at the Pusan Perimeter launched their own breakout offensive. The North Korean army, which had pressed so aggressively southward only weeks earlier, suddenly faced encirclement. Seoul was recaptured by late September. The speed of the reversal stunned observers worldwide. What had appeared to be a nearly lost war for South Korea had shifted into a sweeping counteroffensive. North Korean units retreated in disorder. Equipment was abandoned. Prisoners were taken in large numbers. By early October, UN forces had crossed the 38th parallel. This moment carried profound political implications. Originally, the United Nations had intervened to repel aggression and restore South Korea's territorial integrity. Crossing the 38th parallel meant moving beyond defense into the territory of North Korea itself. The mission was no longer simply to restore the status quo. It was to unify Korea under a non-communist government. The decision was debated in Washington and among UN allies. Some feared escalation. Others believed that failing to destroy North Korean forces would only invite renewed conflict in the future. With apparent momentum on their side, policymakers chose to continue north. Pyongyang fell in October 1950. UN forces advanced toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. Optimism grew that the war might soon be over. MacArthur predicted victory before Christmas. But events were unfolding beyond the peninsula. In Beijing, Chinese leaders watched developments with increasing alarm. Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party had consolidated power only a year earlier. The presence of American-led forces approaching the Yalu River posed a direct security concern. A unified, U.S.-aligned Korea on China's border was viewed as a strategic threat. Warnings were issued through diplomatic channels. China signaled that it might intervene if foreign troops advanced too close to its frontier. These warnings were dismissed by some American officials as bluff. They were not. In late October 1950, Chinese volunteer forces began crossing into North Korea. Initially, their presence was limited and not fully recognized by UN commanders. Then, in November, large-scale offensives were launched. The effect was immediate and devastating. Chinese troops attacked with speed and coordination, often at night, exploiting mountainous terrain and surprise. UN forces, stretched thin and advancing rapidly northward, were unprepared for the scale of the intervention. What had seemed like imminent victory turned abruptly into crisis. The war shifted once again. Retreat replaced advance. Winter set in with brutal severity. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Supply lines became strained. Casualties mounted under harsh conditions. The most dramatic episode of this phase occurred at the Chosin Reservoir, where U.S. Marines and other units fought a fierce withdrawal under encirclement. Despite heavy losses, they managed to break out and retreat southward in an organized manner. By early 1951, Seoul changed hands once more. The Korean War, which had already experienced dramatic reversals, now entered a new and more complex stage. The initial invasion, the defense at Pusan, and the triumph at Inchon had given way to a broader conflict involving China directly. The war was no longer simply a confrontation between North and South Korea. It had become a multinational struggle with a potential for even wider escalation. The question now was no longer who would win quickly. It was whether the war could remain limited at all. By the winter of 1950, the Korean War had transformed into something far larger than its original planners had anticipated. What began as a North Korean invasion of the South had become a three-sided war. Chinese forces were now deeply engaged. American troops were retreating under pressure. The confidence that followed the success at Inchon had evaporated. Chinese intervention was not symbolic, it was massive. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River into North Korea. Officially labeled volunteers, they operated with coordination and discipline, using mobility and surprise to offset technological disadvantages. Their strategy relied on infiltration, night attacks, and the exploitation of mountainous terrain. United Nations forces were forced into a strategic withdrawal. The retreat was not a collapse, but it was a sobering reversal. Units that had advanced toward the Chinese border now fought to hold defensive positions further south. The illusion of a quick, decisive victory had been shattered. In Washington, the situation triggered intense debate. President Harry Truman faced a grave dilemma. Escalating the war by striking Chinese territory might provoke direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had not committed large ground forces, but it provided equipment, training, and air support. Soviet pilots flew combat missions in the skies over Korea, though officially denied. The war was already dangerously close to becoming global. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of UN forces in Korea, held a different view from the White House. MacArthur believed that victory required expanding the conflict. He proposed bombing Chinese supply lines inside Manchuria. He suggested blockading the Chinese coast. At times, he hinted at the potential use of nuclear weapons to break the stalemate. These proposals alarmed civilian leadership. The United States possessed atomic weapons. The Soviet Union had tested its own bomb only a year earlier. Escalation carried incalculable risk. Truman was determined to avoid a wider war. His objective was limited: repel aggression and restore stability, not ignite a third world war. The tension between military ambition and political restraint became increasingly visible. In early 1951, MacArthur made public statements that appeared to challenge the administration's strategy. He expressed frustration with limitations placed on military operations. In effect, he advocated for a broader war against China. For Truman, this was unacceptable. The principle of civilian control over the military was fundamental. A commander publicly disputing policy in wartime threatened that principle. The disagreement was no longer merely strategic, it was constitutional. On April 11, 1951, President Truman relieved General MacArthur of his command. The decision shocked the American public. MacArthur was widely respected, viewed as a hero of World War II and the Pacific Campaign. His dismissal sparked political controversy and public debate. Yet Truman remained firm. Expanding the war into China, he believed, would risk catastrophic escalation. The Korean War would remain limited. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, fighting stabilized near the 38th parallel. Chinese and North Korean forces had pushed south, but they too faced logistical constraints. UN forces regrouped and counterattacked. By mid-1951, front lines roughly mirrored the original division of the peninsula. The war had come full circle. What followed was no sweeping maneuver or dramatic reversal. Instead, the conflict hardened into a grinding stalemate. Trenches were dug. Artillery exchanges became routine. Air combat intensified over a May galley near the Chinese border. The war no longer moved rapidly across the map. It settled into attritional warfare reminiscent of earlier conflicts. Hill positions changed hands repeatedly. Casualties mounted for limited territorial gain. Diplomatic efforts began tentatively in mid-1951. Talks were initiated to negotiate a ceasefire. Yet even negotiations became part of the struggle. Disputes over prisoner repatriation and boundary lines prolonged the process. For soldiers on the ground, the war became one of endurance rather than maneuver. For civilians, suffering continued. Cities had been destroyed. Infrastructure lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. The human cost of the conflict extended far beyond the front lines. The Korean War had revealed the new nature of Cold War conflict. It was not total war between superpowers. It was limited war fought under the shadow of nuclear weapons. It was a conflict in which escalation was always possible, but carefully restrained. The dismissal of MacArthur underscored this reality. The United States would fight, but within defined boundaries. The objective was containment, not annihilation. Yet the boundaries remained fragile. Every decision was measured against the risk of Soviet intervention. Every battlefield success was weighed against the danger of widening conflict. The Korean War became the template for Cold War proxy warfare, intense, destructive, but deliberately contained. By 1952, exhaustion defined the conflict. The front lines barely shifted. Negotiations dragged on. Casualties continued without dramatic breakthroughs. The war had entered its longest and most static phase, and still, no peace had been signed. By 1952, the Korean War had lost the dramatic momentum that had defined its early phases. There were no sweeping offensives, no rapid territorial shifts, no dramatic amphibious landings. Instead, there were trenches, artillery duels, patrol clashes, and negotiations that seemed to lead nowhere. The front line had stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel, the very line that had divided the peninsula before the war began. After years of bloodshed, destruction, and international escalation, the map looked strikingly similar to the one drawn hastily in 1945. But the cost had been immense. Peace talks had begun in July 1951 at Pusan, and later continued at Panmunjom. What followed was not a swift diplomatic resolution, but 2 years of tense negotiation. The most contentious issue was not territory, it was prisoners of war. Thousands of captured soldiers refused repatriation. Many North Korean and Chinese prisoners did not want to return home, fearing punishment or political persecution. For the United Nations, forced repatriation violated principles of individual choice. For communist negotiators, refusal to return was politically unacceptable. This single issue prolonged the war long after major offensives had ceased. Meanwhile, fighting continued along the front. Hills were captured and recaptured. Casualties mounted in battles whose names would never become widely known outside military histories. For soldiers on both sides, the war felt endless. In the United States, public support for the conflict waned. It had never been formally declared a war. It lacked the clear moral narrative of World War II. It lacked the defining victory that might justify its cost. Instead, it became a grinding and ambiguous struggle, fought in distant terrain under unclear objectives. In November 1952, a change in American leadership altered the tone of the conflict. Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president, promising to seek an end to the war. Behind the scenes, diplomatic pressure increased. Subtle signals, including suggestions that the United States might escalate if talks failed, may have influenced negotiations. At the same time, international circumstances shifted. Joseph Stalin died in March 1953. His death altered the political dynamics within the communist bloc. The new Soviet leadership showed greater willingness to conclude the conflict. On July 27, 1953, an armistice agreement was signed at Panmunjom. The agreement did not create peace. It created a ceasefire. The Korean Peninsula was divided once more, this time by a demilitarized zone, approximately 160 miles long and 2.5 miles wide. Ironically, it followed roughly the same path as the original 38 parallel. The war had come full circle. No formal peace treaty was ever signed. Technically, the Korean War has never ended. The consequences were profound. Millions of Koreans have been killed, wounded, or displaced. Cities lay in ruins. Families remained permanently separated. The peninsula became one of the most militarized regions in the world. The division hardened into a permanent geopolitical reality. For the United States, the war reshaped military doctrine. It accelerated defense spending. It reinforced a strategy of containment. It demonstrated that Cold War conflict would not always be ideological or diplomatic. It could erupt into direct, large-scale combat. For China, the war solidified its position as a major regional power. Chinese forces had prevented the collapse of North Korea and had challenged American military dominance. The cost was high, but the political message was clear. For the Soviet Union, the war confirmed the effectiveness and limits of proxy conflict. Moscow had supported North Korea and China without committing full-scale Soviet ground forces, avoiding direct war with the United States. The Korean War became the model for Cold War confrontation. It was not total war between superpowers. It was limited war under nuclear shadow. It was a conflict where escalation was possible, but deliberately constrained. And yet, despite its scale and significance, it gradually faded from public memory. World War II had clear beginnings and endings. Vietnam had widespread media coverage and domestic protests. Korea existed between them. Too early for television saturation, too limited for global transformation. But its impact was lasting. The demilitarized zone remains today. Tensions flare periodically. Nuclear weapons now exist on the peninsula. The unresolved nature of the Korean War continues to shape global security. The conflict demonstrated something fundamental about the Cold War era. Peace would not be secured through decisive victory, but through uneasy balance. The Korean Peninsula became the physical embodiment of that balance, divided, armed, and suspended between confrontation and restraint. The Korean War was not forgotten by those who fought it. It was not forgotten by the families divided by it. It was not forgotten by the nation still shaped by its outcome. But in global memory, it often stands in shadow. Yet without it, the Cold War would have unfolded differently. Without it, the doctrine of containment might have remained theoretical. Without it, the boundaries of limited war might never have been defined. In the end, the Korean War did not produce triumph or transformation. It produced a line on a map, a line that still exists, and a reminder that some wars do not end, they pause.